Welcome, everyone. I'm Rose Guastella, representing the Collective Visions Gallery and the CVG Show Committee in Bremerton, Washington. Each year, the gallery hosts the prestigious CVG Juried Show, now in its 15th year, drawing artists from all over the state. You can see this year's show through February 25th in person at the gallery and online at cvgshow.com. One of the events we look forward to sharing during the show each year is a panel discussion about an art-related topic. This year, we're very pleased to introduce Marie Weichman, Professor of Art at Olympic College, who will be leading her panel in a discussion entitled, "What Role Will the Creative Industries Play in the 21st Century?" Here now is Marie, who will introduce the panelists and begin the discussion.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I would like to first introduce our guest panelists, and we have J.W. Harrington, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington in Tacoma. He's an artist and also does a lot of social science type-based work in the community. Tia Hudson, Professor of English and Creative Writing at Olympic College and Poet Laureate for the City of Bremerton. And Alan Davis, chef of Hound and Bottle Restaurant and co-owner of Hound and Bottle with his wonderful wife, Jody Davis. And so we have Alan, Tia, and JW here today to help us figure out a little bit more about art in the 21st century. So I'd like to start. I have a question for everybody. And this is not really a question for you to answer out loud, just kind of keep it in your head. I'd like to ask the audience if you, and also keep this question in mind as we go through the whole conversation today, because it might give you some perspective. When was the last time that you solved a problem? And how creative did you have to get? And how fast did you have to get there to solve your problem? Right? So I ask this because every time we solve problems, we employ creative thinking skills. And a friend recently described the world these days as crushing. And I mention that because it speaks to how much I think we all feel more and more disenfranchised from each other and from job opportunities due to recent explosive dependency on artificial intelligence by a broad range of industries, especially with the onset of the pandemic. So, should we be expecting AI to steal all of our jobs? AI can't think creatively, which means innovation will still be driven by human beings, not AI. If we are to reimagine the future and continue to push innovation, shouldn't we reasonably expect that the number of jobs that focus on creative thinking skills will also grow, and those will be our jobs? One example is the growth of NFTs, right? Non-fungible tokens. NFT marketed digital art where items that were once free and accessible are now part of a billion-dollar industry. Advances in technology have introduced a new currency, cryptocurrency, which is changing how the whole world does business. Another example is the list of digitally based visual platforms for social engagement, such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, just to name a few, and they're growing every day. These platforms have driven a growth in design and content-based jobs. They support marketing efforts for industries everywhere. Every one of us, especially us creatives who have our own studios, we're turning to Instagram to advertise and to market, and we're using Etsy, and we're having to learn to make what we are selling attractive to the audience. That's a visual. Here's another example, data collection. Data collection has become easier due to advances in technology. Every company wants to have data on what they're doing so that they can strategize for the future. And data needs to be communicated in a way that can be universally understood, requiring creatively skilled employees to do the work. So I ask this question: Do these recent events signal a new society where creative thinkers play a more dominant role in a sustainable world? So I'm going to ask our guest panelists to address a few specific questions, and then we'll open the discussion up to the audience. You can go ahead and in the chat box type type your question. And Rose Gustella, who introduced the meeting today, she is going to be following your questions, and she'll be taking notes. And at the end of this whole thing, we'll give you a chance to maybe ask those or have one of the panelists respond. So my questions are going to be geared towards one or all of our panelists. And they'll each have like 5 minutes. They might not take it all. They might take a little bit more, but we'll just go with the flow with it, okay? So this is a question each one of you will answer, but from a different perspective. Has the pandemic, combined with recent advances in technology, redefined how you and or your community functions, does business, etc.? So Tia, how has the pandemic and recent advances in technology changed how you engage with others?
It's changed in my work as a poet. It's impacted that greatly, both for good and for bad. I'm able to join workshop groups and classes and readings across the country, because most of them are virtual. And those are things that I couldn't have accessed before. And I've heard some pretty amazing poets that I always wished in the past I had the money to fly out and go to whatever workshop or a presentation they were doing. And so now I don't need to fly out. And it's also one of my main workshop groups is the people are primarily from the Portland area. And that's been a really important part of my creative life over the last couple of years. The downside, of course, is just there's something about being physically present when you are working with people and when you are reading or hearing others read their poetry. They're really, just that sense of energy, connections are stronger. And so there's there's a real sense, you get a stronger sense of people being engaged with what you're doing. In terms of doing my work, it hasn't changed that much, or at least in my poetry writing. Because it's, although I will say that when I started actually working with people with my poetry, we did a written rewrite that was physical mail, where you would put a piece in, take your last piece out, send it on to the next person, read their comments, and then it would come back around again. That was, you can still do that, but if you do it electronically, it's a lot easier. In terms of my work, my vocation in teaching, it's, I've always taught at least one fully online class each term, but in terms of the pandemic the last few years, I just came back in the classroom last term, and it's so much different. Even when we do a class on Zoom at a certain time, and I just am so grateful to be able to connect with my students. I think that in terms of creativity and all of that, it's a give and take. I think that creative minds are going to have to do a lot. I think a lot of places are going to leave virtual meetings up, readings, that people can connect to virtually across the country, because I think that's a very positive thing. It enhances, in that way, it enhances my ability to be creative. I think that whenever you're talking about technology, I used to teach in IT. I used to do IT for law firms, and I spent some time in the Nordstrom IT department doing some training. And I think that the best combination in the tech field for people who can think creatively. Because while there's a sort of a linear thing with computers, sometimes you need to make that intuitive to get the answer. And when you're too linear, you just never get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you. All right. I'm going to ask JW the same question. Has the pandemic combined with recent advances in technology redefined how you and or your community resolve social issues?
Interesting you would ask, and my community. The combination of retirement 2 years ago and the pandemic, et cetera, I don't feel lonely because I do see people, but the idea of a community is kind of an odd one for me at this point, actually. But I think socially in general, it certainly has become easier and even more necessary to congregate virtually in our own worlds, and even less likely than before to generate one-on-one relationships that we didn't have before. Some are maintained, but to generate new ones, and to generate and maintain relationships with people who have a worldview different from our own. And I think that's among the reasons why the past few years have hardened positions, social positions of individuals and of groups. And of course, the pandemic itself has been a dividing rod. 2 years ago, in February of 2020, I wouldn't have thought that a major thing like a pandemic would become a dividing rod. But at this point, the only way to resolve social issues seems to me, because we're not talking to one another, I'm not talking to one another, which I'm part of the problem, is the increasingly limited sphere of the ballot box, or through one side's tactic of brute force. So I think the pandemic has, along with the previous 4 years, has indeed redefined how we resolve social issues.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I hear a lot there. Thank you. Alan, so restaurateur that you are, has the pandemic combined with recent advances in technology redefined how you do business?
Certainly. I think every business, especially brick and mortars, have had to come up with new things. I mean, technologically, first, I think just a sort of an anecdote. It'll be 8 years in May that we opened our restaurant portion in our tiny little corner of Bremerton here in the Northwest. And it was a couple, well, I don't know, maybe a handful of years in. And I was actually, I was handed paperwork that we were being sued for our name. And we had a previous name. And honestly, I thought it was a joke. It seemed so absurd that this small little restaurant, I mean, even, coming on 8 years in, we're a little independent restaurant. But my wife, 8 years ago, Jody, spelled with an I, not a Y, which is on the thing there, was sort of initial in working with social media. I had no interest in it. I was in the kitchen, in the bar, and trying to pretend to be a restaurateur, which is an ongoing effort. But it turned out that her efforts in the technological world of social media put us in a place where when someone typed in our pre-existing name, our name came up to the top of search engines. And a very large corporation based out of Dallas and Los Angeles didn't like it. So they had to seek us out in our little weird enclave that I love so much. And because we're not just going to knuckle under, we kind of fought a little bit, spent too much money, and eventually changed our name anyway. So yeah, technology has made a very keen effect on how we do business, right down to our name. the pandemic was, it was a really fast pivot, and it forced us into having to gain understanding of technologies and opportunities that just, we had really no level of expertise in. So, whatever, 2 Marches ago, we had to, we shut down. And unfortunately, being a brick and mortar restaurant, like many of my colleagues, I tried to either find some sort of way to keep people employed, and then eventually had to just lay the staff off in hopes that we'd be able to bring them in sometime soon.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, in those very early days, all we had was, we just had to-go business. And the only way to really reach people who were, isolating in their homes was through the technological platforms. And, Bremerton, being the stellar and beautiful community that it is, supported us in a tremendous way. People would put their orders in. We would try to figure out, we actually went down to one night a week. We just had like Friday dinner. That was it. So I'd come in, I'd have maybe somebody come in and spot me. Jody would be up front, man in the front, I'd be in the back, and we'd have folks generously line up and order dinner from us, which kept winning our sales and kept the boat afloat. But without the ability of having that technology, it would have been tremendously more difficult. And I'm sure that's probably a lot of people that weren't able to pivot or just simply didn't want to pivot, and it was costly for them. So, for us, we had a pretty hard learning curve, especially on my end, since I am, a food and beverage creative, which doesn't necessarily engage on technological platforms that often. So it was a way to connect with our people, and of course that translates not only to marketing but sales and a lot of people even with delivery now. It's not something that I directly engage with, but I have delivery services that do come in and pick up food to go. So it's kind of like, so many different layers of our restaurant industry is now kind of been focused and honed into it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, what I'm hearing is back to that whole creative thinking. These recent technology, but the pandemic has required us to rely on our problem solving skills to survive. And that's the creative thinking factor. And I kind of have to wonder if, in fact, that is becoming more evident to the world, that creative thinking is what can save you. So therefore, let's do more training, right, in the creative thinking industry.
Hopefully.
So let's see. I guess this next question is geared to each one of you. Same question, but a 5-minute answer from each one of you to the same question, not as specified. In what ways has the technological innovations impacted creative output for you and your business? And by that I mean, creatives can be, as we know, chefs, culinary, as well as painters, right? But gardeners too. So the creative industries is quite broad. And so the question is, has technological innovation impacted creative output for you and your business? For example, do you do more business online than you used to? And are there any practices you adopt during the pandemic you adopted that you'll keep? If you, like Tia, you're a poet, JW, you're an emeritus professor, so you really might not be teaching anymore, but maybe in retirement, you're doing things in a different way because you're available in a different way. So maybe technology isn't changing that much for you, but I also want to know, do you think the kinds of changes that you adopted will drive an increase in jobs that require creative thinking trained applicants? So JW, let's start with you. You're muted. That's okay. People like to mute me all the time.
Well, I mean, I'm focused and I'm really here in my capacity as a visual artist. I am so glad that I retired at the moment I did. In terms of, I hate Zoom for a whole bunch of reasons. I feel it's an invasion of privacy. I generally set up my study so that light's coming in from behind me. That's the way I like to work. So I have to reorient everything so that light is not coming in behind me, which is a problem in video. So I've done very few. This is probably about my 50th Zoom interaction of any sort in the past 2 years. When I go back to the teaching, when we pivoted, and Tia noted how fast we had to pivot in classroom settings, I decided that I would do what I do in the classroom on paper and through written communication, because I didn't want to bug my students into joining each other in a bunch of blank squares on a screen, because totally understandably, in the experience of most colleagues I've talked with, most students turn their cameras off. And I think that makes it, if I were in that student situation, I'd do the same thing in most cases. So it was very difficult, so I just didn't do it. I interact with students in a bunch of different ways. In terms of my artwork, the innovation and the pandemic combined to affect the sources of inspiration for my work. I do more reading and more viewing in print and online, and less viewing of people and artwork in the flesh, so to speak. And like a lot of visual and dramatic artists, certainly, I've gained some inspiration from the sense of interiority that these past 2 years have fostered. I even painted a series of 15 small pieces with the title Divok, which is COVID spelled backwards, that focus on a sense of being enclosed, being interior, looking through a long view, looking with some circumscription to one's view. So it affected my sources of inspiration. The things haven't affected my creative products, my actual work, because I rely completely on the, 2 centuries old, a century and a half old technique of oil, and even more, I rely on the mid-20th century development of acrylic paints and mediums. And I haven't gotten into digital art, for example. So for me, it hasn't really affected my products or production. However, it certainly has affected my dissemination and announcement of my work. I've been very involved with, in my own way, my own limited way, social media, my website. There's been some in-person viewing, but not very much, and a digital newsletter. And really, since I started painting and trying to disseminate my work 7 years ago, all of those have been important. And the pandemic just kind of knocked out the in-person viewing in my studio, by and large. I guess I'll say, here's my general thing for today, my general personal theme, if you will, for the day. Like many people I read, certainly over the past few years, I've read that many people feel that they themselves are okay or have come out of downturns and illnesses, et cetera, fairly well, but they're concerned about the state of the world overall. And that's kind of where I am. I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate through all of this, just incredibly fortunate. But I don't see good things overall coming from the past couple of years.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely a full discussion right there for sure. And if I can keep those thoughts in my head, I might come back to them because there's a ton of them up here. So Alan, do you find that technological innovation, you talked about websites and having to really pivot because of the pandemic, but how much of what you adopted is going to be a permanent part moving forward in a post-pandemic world? And do you sense that maybe at some point your business will incorporate a paid job, you know, a person who's actually in the position of doing your creative work for a living for you?
Sure. Yeah, I certainly alluded that we had a pretty like stark and immediate pivot into, you know, digital sales and how it did keep us going and supported us. I do think that I have a lot of colleagues that are in the Seattle and urban areas, and they, I think, suffered a little more. I think being in a smaller community was a really large advantage for my business, for Jody and my business. People know you, and you're able to connect with them, not only through social media, but through your own websites. I know that the online and digital sales that we've incorporated have continued to be a source of business for us and revenue support and engagement. And I anticipate that it will probably only become more so. I do think that, you know, as a brick and mortar, you can't just hang your shingle out anymore. It's, you know, it is a different world. I'm incredibly fortunate. My wife Jody is a designer, and she's worked for Barney's New York. She worked with Tommy Bahama. She has multiple jobs she's working on right now as well. So I mean, and I've always had the consideration that, I mean, people can call themselves, you're a designer, but design, in my estimation, to your point, Marie, is a way of overcoming a problem or an obstacle. It's not just merely fancy
Right.
and whimsy, but so yeah, we currently have Jody, who works on posts for us and broadcast emails for our special events and social engagement, which I'm proud to say that we've had the whole time that we've been operating business, and that's one of the reasons that we're able to connect with our community, because, I mean, they connect with us because we like to connect with them. And I foresee a time in the future when Jody might have too much going on to maintain her level of work that she puts in. So I might be looking to find someone to do that. And I think that I think probably every business is going to need to have that person that gives you know, your community, whether your community is global or is as local as Bremerton, Washington. You know, you got to tell your story. You got to get, and people are used to that. They want it now. And, you know, I think that, you know, I know some people who they hired a person to do that kind of job, and then they didn't see the value in it or something, and they're like, I don't know, I'm paying too much money for this person. They just sit around, and I'm like, buddy, it takes so much longer than you think. And then, you know, you look at some of those people who don't employ the people, and you're looking at their feed, and you're like, yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know what kind of story you're telling the people. So I think yeah, I think there's going to be a definite need.
Yeah, it's great that you ended on that whole need to tell the story factor, because I do think the audience, the public, is now more hungry for story when it comes to what they're going to choose to participate in. And Tia, being a poet and creative writer, you know, you're all about the story and the connecting in that sense. And so would you say that things you've adopted in your way of doing business or your creative process will stick around? And do you think as a teacher, you would be more inclined than you used to be telling students that, yeah, there are jobs out there for creative people?
Yeah, I'm especially encouraged by several articles that have come out in the last year or so about places like businesses and tech firms looking more for people from the liberal arts in general, because of that need for that creative thinking. They see a value in it. They've seen a value. In terms of how it's affected me, I come a little late to some of the technology that a lot of new poets are using. For instance, I don't have a website. I'm actually in the process of being built by a professional, a designer. But with everything going crazy the last couple of years, it wasn't the top of my priority.
Yeah.
And then I joined Instagram just in the last couple of years, even though, and I haven't posted a lot there, but I get a lot of influence, reading some of the poems there, and especially I've gotten really enamored of, and this is something that shows up really well in Instagram in a screen context, and it's blackout poetry, where you take a page and you mark out certain words to create a poem with the words that are left. That intrigues me, and that works really well on screen. Although of course you can do it in person, but or by hand. My creative side, in terms of what I produce as a creator of that work, don't go into poetry for money, kids. It just, it's not about what I earn from it. That's not how I make my living. And many poets don't, many creative writers don't, but especially poets. But there has been a huge explosion of poetry and literary magazines and art magazines in the last few years. And one of them, a really good one, is the Two Sylvias Press in Kingston. And they started out because they didn't see, this is maybe, I don't know, maybe they're 2 years old, but at the time they didn't see a lot of women electronic poetry resources that were focused on women's poetry. And so their first book was only a digital book. And they initially started out focusing on that. Since then, they have also produced other books. One of which was a Washington, one of the Washington State Awards, but for poetry. But that brought home to me, because one of the women who co-owns it is a friend of mine, and that just brought home to me how powerful it could be to make use of that resource of the internet, of digital work. And it so I don't see it going away anytime soon. And I think that both the tech side and the creative side really merge it. And so I think, yeah, it's going to bring more people in who need to be creative and need to have that creative mindset, even if what they're doing is a technical work behind the scenes. So we also at OC produce a literary magazine, and this year it just came out. We didn't do it last year because of the pandemic. This year it came out only as a digital edition, and we're working now on the one that's going to come out next year as a paper edition as well. We've always done a digital edition as well as a paper edition, and that's, it just makes sense to do those things now.
Mm-hmm.
So being active on, so I'm still old school enough that I do a lot. I spend a lot of time on Facebook, but there are a lot of poetry groups out there, and I am just happy to find them there. Especially, like I said, when you can't meet in person and you want to ask somebody a question, or you want to find out about where your favorite poet might be reading next, or any of that. So there's, and as I said before, the main drawback to me is just losing that in-person connection. Mm-hmm. And JW, I was thinking about what you said, where you said it's difficult to start new relationships. And that was kind of a aha moment when you said that, because I've always held that things like Facebook have put me closer to people that I wouldn't normally stay close to, you know, friends across the country or in Europe or whatever. And then I've always appreciated that. But I think you're right. I think it's harder to create new relationships together. And I really, that's set me off on a whole other road thinking about that, about maybe working on that, or trying to start new relationships. I mean, some, you know, have come up, but you think, but it really, it was a light bulb for me, I think.
That would actually be a very interesting experiment. Starting new relationships that are not on dating sites.
Oh, I didn't think that.
Okay, so I have, let's see, one more question for each of you to answer. And I'd like to know, what does a more prominent and visible role for creative industry workers look like to you as we move forward in the 21st century? For example, do you envision more non-creative based industries like law, scientific research, etc., hiring or adding more creative industry trained employees to their staff? If you do or you don't, maybe share why or what your thinking is. So Alan, do you want to give that one a go first?
Sure. Yeah. I think the largest driver that I see currently, being in a suburb of Seattle. Jody and I lived in Seattle for about 20 plus years, and we moved here about 15 years ago, maybe a little more. When we first moved over to Bremerton, we thought, well, we'll be in Bremerton for a little bit, and then we'll head back to the city, because we're kind of city kids. I use the term kids loosely, but I love being in the area that we are. I champion it, and what I've seen in the past couple of years is a migration out of urban cores into surrounding areas. And I think with people working remotely, they don't have to have expensive, places in the city to live. The amenities have kind of shriveled up a little bit in those areas. I think they're coming back, but I do think that there is a larger push for, for professionals, creatives and non-creatives, there is such a thing, to be in these outlining areas. And I see it because, there's people that we work with on a regular basis. Joni that does our website. Not that she was always a big city kid. We've known her from here, but she's a professional that works in this area. And there are a couple of photographers that we've engaged with that do live in the city, but are looking to kind of come out here. And I think that going back to the storytelling aspect, I think people, any engagement that they have, the public is now looking deeper into the story of whatever it is that they're buying, whether it's food, maybe even if they're getting an attorney. What is this attorney? I'm going to look and see what this attorney's done before. I certainly in science stuff, we've got a friend who works at the Hutch, and there's a lot of more creative things and layers that they'll have to put in to be able to reach out to the community. And I do think that it's something that is going to be necessary. How much all the businesses engage in the understanding of how to connect to the larger amount of people is yet to be seen. But we've all had to slow down, and when we slow down, then we start looking around, especially if we're stuck in a little room. You've got the little box to look at, whatever device you've got. God willing, people still pick up books and read poetry. And by the way, Tia, If you know Amanda Gorman, can you tell her hi for me, please?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Um, So, I mean, and I think that, I mean, I know that there's another friend of ours who lives here, Dr. Chuck Wood, who he did biomedical illustration, and now he is a teacher at DigiPen, or at least he was recently. I think he's still there. And that is burgeoning a whole new aspect of different creatives that go into all kinds of, I mean, but that can be law, that can be science as well. So hopefully people take advantage of the creative workforce that's out there.
Yeah, great, awesome. Yeah, I agree. I do think that science is a very good example, I think, because they're used to relying on creative thinkers. And I hope that we'll see more industries that are not used to it moving forward in that direction. But it is a question, will they latch on, you know, and figure out a way, recognize how those people are of value to them. Tia, what do you think about that question of hiring, you know, what's the role of creative industry workers in your view as we move forward? And do you think that they're going to have a bigger role in a sustainable world for us in the future?
I think so. I first came to OC heading up the legal secretarial program there because I had 25 years in the legal field, and then that program folded and then moved me to the English department. So I can tell you that in legal, it's highly, when I was there anyway, because I've been here for 2 years now, but when I was there, it was my greatest skill for the attorneys I worked with was a knowledge of literature and writing, because you know, they would, even a simple thing like they would use a quote that they knew was from Shakespeare, but they didn't know what play or where it was. And sometimes I could just tell them, other times I go look it up. So I knew how to do that. They're used to looking in you know, legal databases, not in literature searches. So I think there is already that creativity there. And in that field, and because you do need to write well as an attorney, you're still filing briefs, it still goes on paper, or at least electronically it's read. I think I'm encouraged by a city government like Bremerton and the Arts Commission that would want to have a poet laureate. I'm the first for Bremerton, and things have really been stymied in some ways by COVID and all of that. But there's I do these 10-minute typewriter poems where on First Fridays, a lot of times I'll go downtown and on a typewriter have someone give me a topic and I'll write them a poem in 10 minutes or so. And some pretty good stuff's coming out. But people are always, at least 1 or 2 people a night when I do that will say, I didn't know we had a poet laureate. I'm so glad we did that. I have a little thing that says City of Bremerton poet laureate. Yeah, and so people are always grateful that we have that position. This is my 2nd term. So if you know anybody as a poet who might want to take over, please let them know if they can apply. Not for a year though. But and again, you know, as I said, poetry isn't really an industry in the sense of making a living out of it. I get a stipend from the city, fairly minor stipend, and which I appreciate. And then we also, but what that has done is it's created at different points community within the city, and throughout Kitsap. Different organizations have asked me to come and do poetry workshops, or there was a year ago in October, there was a domestic violence, because October is the anti-domestic violence month. And they had me host an organization that actually held up in Hallsville, a reading. And there was just a sense of being part of connecting with people, both who had been survivors of domestic abuse and people who were had written about it. And so it just builds that sense that behind the scenes here, there's so much going on. And the more that we can share that in words, the better it is, even if it may not be a specific position like poet laureate or, creative designer or whatever it is. We have a great arts commission that oversees projects that do great things for the city, and I think makes living here a lot better. So all those things work together, and I think if you have a group, a city, a community that doesn't have some sort of creative input and work going on, you have a city that just isn't as vibrant and as full of life as it needs to be. By the way, I love Hounded Bottle.
You like what?
I love the Hounded Bottle.
Oh, and all.
I order from you. So.
Yeah, we're fans too. That's wonderful that you shared how in the legal system, with these lawyers who are so specifically trained in analytical maybe thinking, and also ways to argue a point, still do need somebody to go and pull that creative language out and help them work through it.
Yeah.
And that's not to say anything lesser of the lawyer. It just means that there is a place that we're beginning to increasingly recognize of value.
Yeah, and attorneys sell their time and they sell their language, their words. I mean, that's what you're paying them for. And so, it makes sense that they want to use language well. I also think that, and that's true of a lot of industries.
Mm-hmm.
I used to teach a business correspondence course that was mainly about how to do memos and letters and documents from a business point of view. And there are a lot of creative writing techniques that you can teach that help that be something that somebody wants to read.
Yeah.
So, I think all the way down the line, we just need people, and in terms of creativity with language, I think we just need those people in all those areas.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so that brings us to you, JW. What is your view or vision for the 21st century in terms of the future for us creatives?
Well, I guess since we do have some time, I am a social scientist, and I don't understand what we mean by creatives. In other words, we're using creative industry workers. We've said artists. We've said, in the kind of urban development literature, there are a couple of people who've made lots of money for social scientists talking about the creative industry, and basically a whole lot's included in that. Not just architects and engineers, but indeed lawyers and teachers, et cetera, are called creative, and I don't disagree with that. But if I could ask at least the other three of you, what do you mean when you've said creative so far this hour?
I think I'll answer that first. For me, when I refer to, particularly in this context, a creative industry or creative worker, it's somebody who has a skill base that is focused on thinking and problem solving, maybe even as a service. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're the go-to person at the law firm or the doctor's office to solve this problem in terms of how are we not getting the word out to the public, or how can we find a solution to our research here. I mean, what are we not doing, that creative thinking process? But it does also include the obvious. So I think for me, the use of that word is specifically to highlight that I am not specifically referring to makers, to artists, painters, poets, songwriters, dancers. I am referring to gardeners and chefs and creatives who make a living thinking, for better or worse to the term, outside the box for those who might need it. So for me, when I say it, it really is a term I use in the context of the conversation.
Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, in my estimation, a creative is one that whatever endeavor applies an original or a non-repetitive perspective. They're not just reproducing somebody else's idea. They are coming to an experience, whatever that is, and then they are forced to. I mean, I see plumbers have to, on a regular basis, get pretty creative, and I think a lot of tradespeople, and but I mean, there are some that they receive direction from someone else, they repeat that motion, and that's all they do. I guess maybe that would be non-creative, but other than that, it's just coming up with an original perspective on a problem or an event.
Tia?
I think too that we tend to think of creative and artists as specialized. You have to. There are some areas, even poetry. A lot of people write poetry. I wrote poetry from the time I was a child, but I didn't get serious about it till I had a class in it and realized there were methods and things that I needed to learn to do to use in order to write poetry, better poetry. But in general, I think that creativity and creative products. When I applied to be poet laureate, one of the things I talked about was wanting to bring in a sense of everyday people, whatever they did in their life, but to bring them in and say, you too can write, you too can be a poet, that there's a side of you or a part of you, if you're interested in this, you don't have to have an MFA to do this. And it's interesting to me because it's like within those creative endeavors, in the past, it wasn't unusual to have people in different business or occupations that didn't have anything to do with their writing, who are some of our best poets. Now, a lot of poets are teachers. A lot of poets have a Master of Fine Arts in poetry or in creative writing. And if you go to workshops and people introduce themselves, they often talk about their degree. And those who don't have a degree are a little bit ashamed of that. And so now when I go into groups and I introduce myself, I don't tend to highlight the MFA. I do in teaching because I want to impress the students, but because I was in my 50s when I went back to college. I was a published poet. I wanted to reconnect with poetic community and get to know some other people and just kind of expand in that. And I'm really glad I did. It was a great program. But my focus wasn't on having a degree that somehow made me a poet in a way I hadn't been before. And so the sense that in order to be a creative, you have to have all the credentials to do that is something that I think we need to get away from. We need to bring in worker poets. We need to bring in worker ceramics makers.
Yeah.
All of that, because it's a part of who we are as human beings is to create. And I think that we have downplayed that so much, especially in terms, and this is my little soapbox thing, in terms of seeing education as a way just to get a job, not as a way of thinking critically or thinking creatively. It's, get this degree so you can get better money and better job and, beat out someone else. And I sometimes think, our students are not a product. Our students are people who may need a little help with thinking along these lines and to recognize in themselves that creative potential. I tell my composition students, my 101 students and 102 students, English 101 and 102, basic composition students, every time you write something, even if it's an academic paper, you're putting something of yourself out there. You're making yourself a little bit vulnerable by what you're writing about. And even if it's, an argumentative research paper, that's what you do when you write. And I just I don't know, I want to get away from this idea of that creativity is only limited to creative people. It's not. We need to bring it out more in everybody.
Well, and I would piggyback on that to answer JW. One thing I do tell my students as well is that when they come to me saying they don't have a creative bone in their body, I tell them we are, as human beings, inherently creative. Every one of us does. And that's why I open this conversation with the problem solving. When was the last time you solved a problem? That plumber that Al talked about, you know, we all have to get creative. So we can all be creative at times. But I guess what I'm looking for in this conversation, which might help you answer your view, is do you see the world as becoming more culturally, publicly open to recognizing that creative skills are of value enough to make sure you have people on staff or you're paying someone in your service-oriented business to provide those like split whenever you need it? So what do you see in terms of possible change or no change at all for creative thinking, strengths, and skills in the workforce in a world that is becoming more and more dependent on AI?
Well, a great deal of the responses in our conversation, a great deal of it suggests that the noun that we're really after is creativity, embodied in anyone. So, in other words, if you really think deeply about what the question is, it's actually a very difficult question. I do have some answers, though. But you know, scientific research is certainly creative. You're trying to create a way of looking at something that didn't exist before. You're trying to design experiments or design data testing that will yield something, and that's not out of the box. Certainly, things and the creativity can be taken from things. For example, the distinction we seem to make between the chef and the cook. If the cook is in an institutional situation where they're following instructions directly, then the creativity comes when something's about to burn and how do you do something about it. But when I go into my kitchen, it's an eminently creative activity. Attorneys are actually paid in part to research past case law to creatively come up with the type of cases that were argued and were won in a certain way, decisions that were made that will help them win their case. And it's not at all cookie cutter. So many things are in fact creative, require creative thinking and creative people. To some extent, like in medicine, some medical professionals, especially medical doctors, are increasingly disenchanted because they're given such little time to work with a patient and understand the context of the patient's presenting characteristic or issue, that they can't be creative and therefore can't really be good physicians, because being a good physician is creative. There's nothing written on the person that says here's the problem. And so creativity abounds. I think that maybe AI, but I think just time pressure in the for-profit, the business-making world, the world trying to make some money. The time pressure results in an attempt to try to separate creativity from the work to be done. And in fact, maybe that's why there is a greater need for creative people, because many people have less and less time to approach their problem creatively. So I think and I don't think it's just AI. I think there's a lot of just pressure. However, I think in terms of the employment of people considered creatives, or people who are creative, corporate actors, and for that matter, small businesses, as Alan noted, more and more need creative energy, creative time, actually paying for creative time to differentiate and promote their products and services. And Alan noted that, we kind of all noted that. And that's vital because there are more competitors in some marketplaces, not at all, but there's also more splits in the marketplace. We're quite divided by economic well-being. Almost everyone in the US is a consumer of some sort, but the kinds of things we consume vary greatly with our economic capability and political affiliation. If I'm trying to sell even a widget nowadays, I've got to decide whether I'm going to try to sell the widget in a blue way or in a red way. Because in fact, there are companies that will buy only blue bit widgets or red widgets. A big success story for kind of creativity and the way I think we're kind of focused on over the past quarter century is the gaming industry. Estimated worldwide sales of $179 billion last year in gaming, and $340 billion if you include the software and hardware that has to be created to do the gaming. In the US, employment of about 500,000 people, and a significant portion, absolutely not all, of those 500,000 people are creatives in software design, which is clearly a creative activity, artwork, and marketing. So that's a whole industry that has blossomed based essentially on creativity and based on the leisure time that people have and the need to kind of focus on something different. So these immersive worlds are increasingly attractive. And then, of course, we're seeing this. I don't think this is huge in terms of employment, but it is getting large in terms of money. A merger of artistic and commercial forms in the big money world of digital, animated, visual art, music, and games combined with cryptocurrency. And I think it'll be interesting to see you can only speculate here. I'm thinking that most of the visual artists I know and interact with, except for very few that I know so far, are going to stay far away from that world. But the money is to be made in this intertwining of these worlds, the big money art galleries, the big music studios, Hollywood, and the attempt to actually really make money off of something that is supposedly unique. And it certainly is teeming with creativity of various sorts. I'll refer you to an article posted today in the New York Times by a fellow named Zachary Small on kind of the interaction of these worlds and what I will call the big money art world. Move on outside of the corporate or the attempt to make money, which I don't think is a bad thing, but it's to make money. Non-governmental organizations and activists are going to have to rely even more on creative thinking. If you want change, you can seek change from above, from the powerful, or below. Those with power will only change if it enhances their power. So it takes a fair amount of creativity to present an issue to those in power with any prayer of getting them to see that change may enhance their power and therefore may back it. Those without power, okay, so it's the mass. This is the ballot box, increasingly constrained, and its more direct forms of motivation. Many progressives have felt that the truth will set you free. If you present people at large, people through the internet, through tables, through documentaries, if you present people with enough of good information, they'll realize what the truth is and how they should proceed. No. We are surrounded by facts. We're surrounded by truths. We're surrounded by alternate truths. And what moves us, and I mean, I'm saying us because I think I fit in this as well. What moves us is a coherent narrative. And someone mentioned narrative earlier, story earlier. If I were to, for example, how often have you read an article or a piece or something in the kind of journalistic outlet that you prefer, let's say it's Washington Post or New York Times or whatever, and you've become outraged because of what you've learned in that article. They can't do this. I've got to get off my bum and do something about this. Okay. Well, that's in part because of what was presented, but in large part because of the narrative you already have. If you were to send that same article, if it was short enough, to someone you know, an uncle or whomever, who has very different worldview than you, that person would very likely skim that article. It might make them so mad that someone is propounding this nonsense, they might not read the whole thing, but would skim that article and would want you to realize just how stupid that article was, because it doesn't jive with their narrative view. If we're going to get anywhere with people's narrative views, we're going to have to use really creative, kind of artful, but not necessarily visually art, okay, but artful ways of getting to people. And here, what I'm really relying on, I'm so unaccustomed to Zoom, I don't even know whether if I hold up something that's written, will it appear to you backwards or not? I don't even know. This is backwards?
Yeah. We can
Okay, it's The Art of Activism. The Art of Activism is by two Steves. They refer to themselves as the two Steves, Steve Duncombe and Steve Lambert. It's a great book. It's a very easy read. It's thick, but it's a really easy read. And it's about the ways in which one can artfully, and again, they're including drama, including visual art, but not at all focusing only on those. But you can artfully tell a story, get people's attention in ways that are compelling. It can make people at least hear your story, may become compelling enough to get people to think about their own stories.
There's an article from Mother Jones a few years ago called The Science of Why We Don't Believe Science. And in that and in other writings about studies that have been done in the last maybe 15, 20 years on brain and people, anyway, the basic idea is if you just try and present people with facts, they usually, especially if they have, strongly held views, they will double down on what they believe they know. And they'll say to you something like, I don't care what the statistics say, I know what I know. And that the way to approach someone who has a different, especially strongly different point of view than you do, is to find some connection within common values or beliefs, not on facts. And this was made, one of the big examples of this that happened was with gay rights and marriage rights, was when several of the leaders in different parts of the nation began to focus on marriage rights. It wasn't all about just feeling, they wanted this. It was, this is a way that we can say to people, we're just like you. We're like you, we want a family. We want a partner, we want a marriage, just like you do. And that changed the narrative of the gay rights movement, in a way that, and it brought about that change radically fast, much faster than I ever thought I'd see in my life as a lesbian. So that idea, again, of artfully bringing that, I think that's part of what we're talking about, is you can't just present facts and have it connect you with people. You must, even in the sciences, present it in a way that's going to help people at an emotional level, at a values level, a belief level, connect to it. And I think that's where creativity comes in. I think that, and like you say, it's prevalent in almost every occupation, and no matter how technical that occupation might be.
Yeah. I actually had a huge thought there and it's just gone. But I think, generally speaking, what I'm hearing here is exactly what we've been wanting to figure out or discuss is the world recently, when I referred to it earlier as my friend saying it feels crushing, and we get these facts of all kinds of issues just thrown at us, and we do have a division, those who push back on the facts and those who embrace the facts, and et cetera. And so maybe we're looking at a world that will turn to those creative writers, right? The people who know how to conversationally create that narrative so that we can come together and mend the fences. Maybe the disruption in this world that we're seeing on so many levels, climate and social issues and, economic issues, maybe it's time for the creative narrative problem solver. JW, was there anything else you wanted to add to the rest of your answer before we maybe turn it over to some Q&A?
Well, actually, it occurs to me, if I were just to speculate, that we may see what I'll call an anti-art movement in reaction to the freedom and the expressiveness and experimentation of what we consider kind of artistic activity or endeavor. One of the things, among the things that has to happen to engage people positively with totalitarianism is to remove experimentation. And I think that's something we need to prepare for. Book banning is certainly a part of that. And so the age, despite what we're coming into, and I want to hear more about the need for creative ways of expressing things, and how do we do that is the question. I think we also have to recognize that we're going to have to fight back somehow, how is that, against kind of a movement toward anti-art or art that is somehow approved or sanctioned, something to keep in mind.
Ursula Wynn said one time, this is probably pre-computer age, but she said one of the first things that totalitarian governments do is ban the printing press or the typewriter. And I think that, that's very true. And I think it's not just for written arts, but other types of arts are just seen as subversive just by being art. William Stafford is one of my favorite poets, traveled, he was a poet laureate, he's Library of Congress poet, before it was called Poet Laureate, and he traveled overseas a lot. And there was one of his poems that when he was in the Soviet Union, they wouldn't allow him to read. And it had to do with bringing silence and bringing back sound. And for you, but he wasn't allowed to read that there. And then there was another time with Pete Seeger where he was told in one country he couldn't sing certain songs. And his response, he told his audience and he said, "But I know you guys know this song, so they've only banned me from not singing it, so go for it." And his audience sang the song. So, I mean, that sort of role of the artist in an attempt to silence.
Well, here's a thought in that anti-art comment. We do see growing reliance of self-employed makers, jewelers, potters, whoever they might be, using Etsy, right? They're making their stuff, even painters, printmakers, they're kind of going around that gallery format and they're being their own person. And it doubles the workload, of course. But now we have, all of a sudden we have this format where anybody can make something and sell it. Quality aside, it's there, it's available, we can all do it. Do you think, and any one of you, I'm happy to hear from, do you think maybe this might play into some of that, what we might see as a sort of push towards anti-art attitude, is that everybody's gonna say, well, I don't know, I can do that and I'm gonna do that. What do you think, JW?
Well, I think yes, and I think the burgeoning of people's feeling that they can create, that's what we need to foster. However, any particular digital platform like Etsy can certainly be snuffed out by, by the government for that matter. I mean, China is certainly showing that digital platforms are actually quite vulnerable. However, we can then, people will return to person exchange of poems, pottery, whatever, reading plays in each other's houses. I mean, it is possible for Alexa to hear what's being read in the house, but you can turn Alexa off for that matter.
That's true. Al, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I have the unique perspective. Well, of the four of us, I am not a professional educator, but I do have the platform of a restaurant, and I was inspired by a friend who had a place that was not large. He was very good at what he did. He was out in Eastern Washington, just outside of Walla Walla, and what he had was so egalitarian. And this was, I don't know, probably like 10 years ago. And he had people coming in from Walla Walla. They were film directors, they were vintners, and then they had people that were working the agriculture side as well. And they were all sitting next to each other. They were all getting the same level of service and same food. That was appealing to me. I try to aspire to that when we're here as well. I don't want to equate myself to the cafes of the French Resistance, but it does have a certain quality where there's enough people that come in that there's a lot of different views that are shared here, especially being in a military town. There's a lot of people that don't share my view, but we can still talk to each other. That gives me a certain level of hope. And I hope that places like these kinds of gathering areas, whether they're brick and mortar or virtual, can provide. I think that obviously being in person, there's a larger level of accountability that people have. They can tell if they're hurting somebody else's feelings. Sometimes it's intentional, but I think a lot of times people don't necessarily, that's not what they want. They just want to be heard. But having a format and hopefully people find my food good but approachable, so anybody can come in. I've got a burger and I've got a tall boy a Rainier, and if that does, if that's too fancy for you, I don't know what I can do. But there's it does provide an area, and even in the times where we had to be a lot more distanced, that has certainly relaxed a little bit. But we can tune into each other's conversations. We can feel like we're together. I think that isolation certainly is a winner for totalitarianism. That making people feel alone and disenfranchised works really well for the Pol Pots of this world, the intellectual anti-art crowds that just are seeking for control. I think getting out and being next to each other. I think farmers markets, farmers are are some of my biggest heroes. They work tirelessly and they give all of us equally what comes out of the ground. And I think that humanity, that connection to the planet that we're in, is certainly is a story and is a narrative people embrace, and hopefully of all social and economic levels. And it can be part of the fabric that brings us back together.
That's beautifully said. And I love that you spoke of hope and that there is some out there still. I feel the same way.
Yeah, there's good. There just has to be.
Yeah, there has to be.
Yeah, I mean, I still, it's like, see your therapist and do what you need to do. I also, I love music. I get to play music. I think that gives, like when anybody has, the ability to do something like that. I played guitar because my dad played guitar. He wasn't necessarily a guy that wanted to perform in front of people, but he had one at his house and he'd play music, play some songs. And you could tell and he was an engineer, a telecom engineer. And I think that gave him an outlet and made him feel better, made him feel part of what we got going on as a human species.
Awesome. I would like to, since it's 3:20, turn it over to the audience. I think Rose has been keeping up with some questions that might be out there. Rose, did you want to step in at this point and maybe facilitate the questions?
I do have a question from Alan Newberg, and I can actually allow him to ask it himself.
Okay.
Alan, if you're still there, I'm going to allow him to talk. Ask to unmute.
All right. So, I guess I come to this conversation as a visual artist, and one that sort of associated with what a lot of people think of as fine art. But for me, art is a way of thinking, and so I use my art to think about things that I want to think about, that problems that I have to solve, or things that I see happening here. So one of the things that I think that art does, I think creativity does this. It gives people a sense of purpose and accomplishment. All of which kind of heads in the direction of what is the meaning in art? Where is the meaning in art? Which is also the same question as where is the meaning in life? And so I
was about to say, where's the meaning of life? Let's ask that one.
So I think that, so I have a saying that's been useful to me in my life as an artist, and it is the more personal you can make your art, the more universal the meaning will be. So I would like to hear the people on the screen respond to that question.
So JW, I'll let you start, but I just want to add, Alan, I think I agree with you. I do tell my students, you can't really make great art unless you've lived a life and have something to say. And maybe to the extent that what you say is that's how you can connect with the rest of humanity, maybe. So JW, what do you think?
I think Alan answered your own question, Alan. I mean, Alan Newberg answered your own question in your brief discussion of it for me, which is that a major thing about creating or working through a problem is the sense of accomplishment. And so the meaning of art is the accomplishment. The meaning of art is the creation. And if that goes back to art for art's sake, so be it. That is actually the most fundamental thing that art serves for us is actually really in its creation. And for some people, that's creating a lovely family, for some, whatever it might be. But the work you go through, in the sense that there is some outcome, a poem, a dinner, or whatever, is an accomplishment, and that's the meaning to me.
So very well said. I had a 9-year-old respond. I'm working on a documentary, and that 9-year-old said she feels inspired when something she does is recognized, valued, and validated. A 9-year-old.
Yeah.
Alan, what would be your response to Alan Newberg? You're muted. Are you muted?
There I go. Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly. I think that, just going back to the just shared humanity. I think that the creator, it can be, something that's individual, can be something that's a collective, and the collective, either can show a reflection of what they see around them. They bring their daily experiences. I bring daily experiences of going to other cities and eating and drinking. I go, there's also, certain, intentions that I become aware of that translate into something as foundational as food. It's certainly, I mean, I went from the kitchen. I'm now working in the bar because I get more face time with all of our clients. And that gives me the ability to, in my restaurant, I like when people think of it as their restaurant. I don't necessarily need to have a great deal of ego in the restaurant. I know that it's my restaurant. It's more rewarding for me when I see people and they have taken a certain amount of investment in this being their like little neighborhood joint. They bring their friends in, and they can show them, look what I found, and then we get to kind of serve that. So they get validated, and in turn I get validated, and we get to have employees that get validated, and that the message goes out, and we get to reconnect with our community, and that's the narrative that I couldn't stress strongly enough that I appreciate about being in our little town.
Well, speaking of your community, I know your restaurant's going to open shortly, and you might have to blow out early. So if you disappear, we'll know why.
It's everybody's starting to get to work, and I'll mute, but then might get busy, and I might have to bow out.
Okay. So, Tia, do you want to give a quick answer for Alan? And that might be the only question we have. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because the idea, to me, I really, for many, many years, I refused to send stuff out for publication. I thought that was mercenary, and art wasn't about money. Teenage, I don't know what it was, but and it's interesting to me. I see that same reluctance in a lot of my younger students, especially running start students who are still in high school, and it's just interesting to me because now I think I want people to read my poetry, not because I want them to buy it, though that would be nice. Harping on that, don't I? But because I want them to read it. And it's not necessarily that every poem is about me. Some of me is in every poem, but or story that I write. But it's what is the purpose of art? We've talked about creativity in terms of being involved in all sorts of different jobs and businesses and things like that. But ultimately, I think it is that sense of accomplishment. It is, here, look what I've done. And this is worth you looking at. This is worth you appreciating. And I'm worth you appreciating. And so I think to a certain extent that youthful sort of, I don't want to publish, specifically talking about that, has a lot to do with, I'm not sure I want you to appreciate me that much. Or I'm not sure that what I do is worthy of your appreciation. And I think that there was, when I was at the poetry reading. We do a poetry reading at Remedy the first and third Monday of every month. We'll start up again in February. And I was sitting at a table with some friends, and I had read that night, and she said something along the lines of talking about art, and she says, well, I'm not an artist, I'm a writer. And I went, oh. And of course, what she meant was I'm not a visual artist, but it's just that sense of valuing that creative aspect of ourselves and knowing ourselves to have this something that should be appreciated, that you can do well, or you might even do it badly, but it doesn't matter. You can put it out there, you can say, look what I did. I couldn't do this before, but I did it this time, and that is so important, not just for the community, but also for the person who's producing that, to have something that they can hold up and say, look what I did. And so I think ultimately for me, that's where my understanding of art is. And it starts with the individual, and it starts as a sharing and a conversation between an individual and those outside of that person. the first time my brother praised one of my poems was just a seminal moment for me. My big brother likes my poetry. So just even that, I think it's important. So that to me is, like you said, it's the production of it, the bringing the thing to life.
Alan Newberg, does that answer your question? In as much as we possibly could.
Well, I just got a sign that said unmute yourself, so I just wanted to make sure I could be heard. I didn't have a new question. Not that I don't, but I didn't.
All right. Well, I would like to thank, even though Alan Davis had to bail because he has a job, he's got a basic restaurant. I just want to thank you three panelists for accepting my invitation. And Rose, thank you for asking me to moderate this panel. It's been an honor and it's very enlightening. I've enjoyed the conversation.